Okay, good afternoon everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you in Lahore. So yes, I'm based in Delhi, and I'm here with several panelists from all over the world. I think for this last session, as we've been through the day, I think it might be nice to change the format slightly in how we do the panel discussion and the comments and questions that come from the floor. So although you may be a little bit tired and feeling a little bit sleepy, I'm actually going to get you to do a little bit more work this time. So if you will indulge me, what I would like to suggest is that after each of the panelists speak, and they're going to have a strict time limit of 10 minutes, I'm going to ask each of the tables to discuss 3 things that you have taken away from the speaker's presentation, and 2 or 3 questions that as a table, or comments that as a table you feel it would be useful to feedback or to ask when we come to the Q&A part of the session. Okay, so as you're listening, please be aware that I'm going to pass that task over to you after each speaker. Okay, so I'm going to very, very briefly, we can only have 1 mic on at a time, otherwise you get that screechy sound. I'm going to very briefly introduce the full panel, and then we will go straight into the first speaker. So I have next to me Dr. Naureen Durrani, who's originally from Pakistan. She's currently working as a senior lecturer in international education and development at the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex in the UK. We have Dr. John Simpson, who's based in Rwanda. He's a senior advisor for English for Education Systems, working with the British Council and responsible for our work there around in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Linda Tsung, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney and previously at Hong Kong University. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Priyatha Nanayakkara, who is the Director of Education for the Ministry of Education in Sri Lanka and is also the Director for bilingual and trilingual programs there. So we will start first with Naureen, if you'd like to go ahead. 3 minutes, okay. Okay, I'll do longer introductions. Okay, you need to wait for your slides, presumably, yeah.
I can go ahead.
Do you want to go ahead?
That's fine.
Yeah?
By the time they'll upload it, on the condition that I get extra 3 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk about is the challenges of multilingual education in post-colonial context, with a specific focus on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia as well as Southeastern Asia. Through a literature review, I look at what are the models of language education policy being used in the region, what are the drivers of these, the selection of these languages, but also I'll then trace how these policies are being implemented and what are the impacts these policies have generated in educational and wider social terms. These countries in post-colonial countries in these regions have particular challenges of making education accessible to all of their citizens. Some of these challenges have already been elaborated upon by several of the panelists. However, there is within the global education policy, whereas the previous MDG regimes didn't engage really with the question of in whose language is education for all to be realized, the current global education agenda in the form of SDGs acknowledges a greater role of the language and education policy in the acquisition of quality, the delivery of quality education system, and in fact it contends that quality of education is strongly dependent upon the delivery of education in a language that children understand. However, globally, around 40% of the world's population is being denied the right to access education in a language that they are familiar with profound implications for equity, which have been repeated several times today. And that's why one of the proposed thematic indicator under equity, target 4.5, is the percentage of children, primary age children who are educated in a language that is familiar to them. And these challenges are profound in countries of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeastern Asia, as well as South Asia, because of these countries have complex histories because of colonial language and education policies and political governance. They also have very high index of linguistic diversity, as you can see from this diagram. So it's important, and alongside that, these countries, several countries in these regions are also facing persistent challenges of both quality and equity. So it's important to look at what policies are being used and how these policies might be implicated in some of these quality and equity issues. So before I give you a broad pattern that emerges within these regions, questions have been asked about what drives language policies. Yeah? So ideally, language policies should be driven by concerns of learning, cognition, social justice, social cohesion, but in practice, as we have seen, they are predominantly within the region. Coming from the literature, they are predominantly driven by concerns of instrumentalism, instrumentalist approaches that see language as an instrument of national economy development within the globalized world through the development of human and linguistic capital that can be then traded in the global capital market. And while these instrumentalist approaches are often state-led and state-centered, they also have the buy-in of parents and other stakeholders, as we have seen. So either such approaches then lead to choosing a foreign language, in most cases English, as the medium of instruction, or on another spectrum, choosing a single national language as a medium of instruction, predominantly for fostering national unity and containing and managing internal ethnic difference, again with profound implications for social cohesion, conflict, as well as equity issues. So when we move on to sub-Saharan Africa, at least at the level of policy in a great number of countries, environment is positive for mother tongue based education or education in a language that is familiar to children within the community at primary level, alongside the designation of English as a language of instruction at some level of primary school. However, often the model used is an early exit model where children then switch over to a foreign language, English or French, after 3 or 4 years of primary school instruction. The situation is quite different in Southeastern Asia, where the predominant pattern is the use of a single national language as a medium of instruction. However, alongside the use of English as a subject at some level of basic schooling and a lot of importance at tertiary and higher level. In South Asia, there is no one specific pattern. However, one trend is that the role of English is strengthening, whereas in India, a 3-language formula is used. So the use of the mother tongue, the state level, and pan-national languages. In Pakistan, the predominant use is the national language as a medium of instruction, with the only exception being rural Sin, and you will hear more about specific examples from some of my co-panelists. So let's see these are policy aspirations, yeah? But what is the evidence on the ground? What is educational or linguistic research is telling us? And you've heard a lot from Carol in that regard, so some of what I would be saying might be just a repetition. Contrary to popular perceptions, that the use of English or a foreign language is important for national development, for personal development, the finding is that actually it is linked to academic underachievement in core skills such as literacy and numeracy. And unsurprisingly, therefore, rather than promoting economic growth, across 33 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a study reports it to be positively related to income inequality. And that's not surprising when learners' numeracy and literacy skills, particularly for the marginalized, are hampered. Then of course, it has adverse effects on income equality. We also see a disjuncture between policy and practice on the ground. So in Africa, where the policy climate is positive, despite the policy prescription, what we see that on the ground, schools are using English or another foreign language as a medium of instruction rather than the use of mother tongue, predominantly because of pressure from parents and other stakeholders, teachers, head teachers, for example. And this is related to, what stakeholders think, what language is important, so their attitudes towards language, and as Abdul Manan in the previous panel said, how people think languages are learned rather than what research is telling how languages are learned. Against that finding, the use of a familiar language or a medium of instruction is reported empirically to be linked to enhanced learning outcomes in core academic skills like numeracy and literacy, but also in non-academic skills like enhanced self-esteem, confidence. Also, we talked a lot about rote memorization in Pakistan and poor quality of teaching. The use of mother tongue is also found to be reported, is also found to be associated with interactive, communicative learning and teaching relationships, pedagogies that are capable of producing quality learning, but also community engagement. Somebody questioned how their literacy levels in Saraiki are so low, how can community engage? In Mozambique, in Kenya, in pilot projects, community members, ex-students, they are engaged in the production of textbook materials so there is a lot of positive support from the community in that respect. But also, contrary to popular perception, a lot of evidence from sub-Saharan Africa tells us that using mother tongue as a medium of instruction then promotes better outcomes in examination results in the foreign language as well. So it's not that it hampers the acquisition of skills in the foreign language or in English. I've been asked to stop, so I'll stop there. Yeah? That's okay. These things might come up in some of the questions.
Okay.
That, yeah.
Okay. So, could you just leave that last slide up?
Oh, sure.
If that's all right. So we'll move now onto the tables, as I mentioned at the beginning. So if with your group, I'm going to give you 2 minutes just to quickly discuss what you took away from what Dr. Naureen has just been talking about, and to note down a couple of questions or comments that from the table you might like to input after the rest of the speakers have shared. global context of language in education policy and has shared some of the issues and the evidence that underpins the thinking around this globally. We're now going to move on to Dr. John Simpson, who is going to start to narrow the discussion a little bit with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And then as we continue through the panel, you will see that the case studies become narrowed down at country level. And the hope is that the points that are being made and the evidence that's being shared will be applicable to your context, to Pakistan, or from the country that you are based in as well. So, John, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. So the task which I've been given is to say a little bit about how mother tongue-based multilingual education looks in sub-Saharan Africa. Quite an ambitious thing to do, given there are 54 countries in the continent, and as Naureen was saying, it's possibly the most linguistically diverse region anywhere in the world. So I'll try to say a little bit about some of the implementation challenges, and also I hope some of the success stories that Carol has very helpfully already alluded to one or two of those, and I'd just like to build on that. If we could move to the next slide.
Mother tongue based education.
There we go. So just want to start with what I often refer to as Africa's language and education paradox, which I don't think will be particularly surprising to folk here. Really, it's really just here, that visual is trying to show the process of exclusion, if you like, how the starting point is very diverse, societies, linguistically, culturally, ethnically, etc. And typically that gets filtered, a lot of that gets filtered out in terms of, often the national language policy dictating education language policy, which is something I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. So what that tends to boil down to within education systems is a bilingual structure. That's to say, there are two languages of learning operating within the system. Typically, an African language, whether that's a local language in some cases or a dominant indigenous language. Again, usually in the early years, in the lower primary cycle, the move to English happening, or French or Portuguese, tending to happen quite early when there isn't really a very strong foundation established in either the mother tongue in terms of cognitive and academic language to sustain, studies across the curriculum, or indeed in the European language to actually pursue that. And then, of course, we've talked a little bit about the monolingual habitus, or I often use the term monolingual mindsets when it comes to what's actually sanctioned within the classroom. And in many cases, the decision takers, senior officials, are very, they're not really, I think, very well informed on bilingual education practices and how they can support learning. Often their views are influenced by their own experience, which has been one of working within a very, a kind of a sequential monolingualism. So you move from learning in your mother tongue to learning in English, but never do you entertain the idea of the possibility of the coexistence of two languages within the same classroom. The argument being that that would be just too confusing for learners, and how could they cope. What that doesn't really address is the fact that for the first 3 years of their formal education, all learning, teaching and learning, has been encoded in one language, in an indigenous language. How, and this begs the question, how then can all that learning, all that knowledge and skills be transferred to the other medium of instruction, European language, if somehow there's no meeting, there's no coming together as for that transfer to actually take place. So there's a huge kind of gap there, and we'll come on to other aspects of that gap in terms of learning, in ensuring that the transferring of learning takes place from L1 to L2, but also the scaffolding of new knowledge and skills in the second language onto existing knowledge and learning in the first. And I don't think we're really addressing some of those key issues. So that really is just again to illustrate what that often looks like. Rather than using all the linguistic resources and assets which children and teachers bring with them to the classroom, we instead have this sort of English-only sort of policy. So it's really, in terms of the efficiency of the system, as Carol was mentioning earlier this morning, it's kind of hugely inefficient when all that gets sort of left behind, or it's simply not sanctioned. We know, of course, that there's a huge divide between policy and practice. And lots of the research in sub-Saharan Africa tells us quite categorically that teachers, being very pragmatic professionals, do actually, they translanguage and they strategically code switch, because they know the kids, essentially in many cases, simply don't understand. The language of the textbooks in English is often far in excess of their emerging competence, as is the language of the teaching. So actually, translanguaging becomes hugely important, simply for kids to be able to understand and follow the curriculum. So the policy is there, but the practice is actually very different. Okay, so what this slide seeks to illustrate is that, in fact, I think we have to look at policy in different ways and at different levels. Now, the fact that we have seen a movement to some degree in sub-Saharan Africa towards accommodating local languages, mother tongues within the education system. South Africa, for example, has approved 11 different languages to be used in education. Ghana has a list of, I think it's currently 8 languages which are approved, and they're looking to extend that further. So I've taken the image here of that being a centrifugal force. So the center allows some of that dynamic to move away and to accommodate other languages for education. So that's the language and education policy, if you like, the centrifugal force. And as we've seen, there are, of course, counter forces to that. And sometimes parents, may resist and prefer to go straight for English or the dominant language. And so there's a huge amount of advocacy work needed there. The other side of it then is more to do with the national language policy. And here, I think that's perhaps more the centripetal force at work, pulling things towards the center. So this is about unifying the country, the idea of one nation, one language, the very 19th century European notion, which is then seen in the classroom, a microcosm of that, one classroom, one language also. And so essentially the argument here is that we've got sort of opposing forces at work here at the national language policy level. There's this desire for integration and a sense of, if we actually embrace more than one language as a national language or official language, then there's a potential threat to the fabric of the nation, to unity, social cohesion, etc. So I really feel that there's still a lot more work to be done here, and Carol actually has written about this in her briefing paper, how national language policy can actually dictate education policy. And so there's a lot of, I think, conflation and confusion going on here. And what we don't really have is a separation of that, and an understanding that really for educational language policies, the key things are teaching and learning and educational outcomes. So really that, I think, is the focus for language and education policy. But sometimes those lines get blurred, and so there's leakage across from the national language policy to the education policy. We also haven't really talked about policy at different levels. And Ethiopia is a good example of this, where there's a federal language policy which sets a framework, and then underneath that, the various regions are allowed to create their own language policies. That should be within the framework, but it doesn't always happen, so you get this disconnect. We haven't talked at all about school language policies and language policies at the local level. We have talked about the bottom-up approach in terms of languages for teaching and learning, but also, I think, we mustn't forget that at the school level and the district level, it's not only possible, but arguably desirable for policies to be created at those levels, which really take into account local conditions and local contexts. And there's some very interesting work going on at the moment in terms of mapping, the mapping of languages in schools and districts to get a much better understanding of which are the languages involved here and how best can we manage these multilingual contexts at the local level. So we mustn't forget policy operates at different levels, not just the national. Okay, so mind the gap. It's really about the mismatch, and we've, I think, touched on some aspects of that, but I think it's really right across the system. So whilst there's maybe political support for the use of local languages, so on paper the policy is there, but I think when you look across the different aspects of the system, from curriculum through textbooks, initial teacher education, teacher deployment, pedagogy and assessment, there are often gaps there. So for the curriculum, etc., and textbooks, they may be produced in English or the dominant language, and teachers are then simply told, well, just translate those, translate the textbook, translate the curriculum into the local language. So that's a huge challenge and sends quite a negative signal, I think. Also in terms of initial teacher education. So to the degree that the mother tongue is welcomed and the policy is there, we often find that teachers are actually not trained in the pedagogy of how to teach the mother tongue or how to teach the language of instruction as a second language where the pupils don't speak the kind of national or dominant language. When it comes to teacher deployment, of course, we often find that in systems where teachers are actually deployed rather than choosing their own workplace, the teacher may not speak the local language, and so there's a real communication barrier there. Also, we mentioned assessment and the lack of alignment between allowing the mother tongue to be used in the lower primary cycle, but then the high stakes examinations, the national examinations which come later, perhaps at the end of primary or in secondary, are not offered in the local languages. So again, huge amount of work, I think, to address some of those gaps. And that's really just to bring home the point that, you know, this early exit to English creates a huge burden, a heavy load for learners, and this is what I call the push factor from English, the huge desire and aspiration to it, sets the whole system out of kilter, if you like, and does a disservice to learning and students. Really, just to say that in the other, I think, important point is just recognizing the urban-rural divide, which has come up in some of our conversations. The single biggest transformation currently going on in sub-Saharan Africa is this huge migration of people from rural to urban areas. It's estimated that by 2040, over 50% of Africans will live in cities. So that's creating really multilingual environments in the cities and multilingual schools. And too often, the response to that, how do we handle multilingual classrooms? The response is a monolingual one. We revert to English as the default position, or we revert to the dominant language, rather than actually seeking multilingual solutions. And there are ways of doing it, which we could maybe talk about later. And finally, just to say that there are some success stories in SSA. Perhaps one of the most frequently cited ones is in Nigeria, the 6-year primary project using Yoruba as MOI, where students performed, as Naureen was saying, one of the most interesting findings when the use of the mother tongue is extended is not only do students perform better in other subjects, maths, science, etc., but also they perform better in the second language, in English or whatever the other European language is, which is almost kind of counterintuitive. From Ethiopia and from Mali. So there are some good news stories there. The challenge is, how do we actually scale some of this up, and how do we address some of those remaining challenges? Thank you.
Thank you, John. Sorry, I feel like a policewoman, like making everyone finish on time. Okay, so we'll go back to the tables again. Same thing, 2 minutes for a quick chat on your tables. What have you taken away from that, and what questions or comments would you like to feed in? I wonder if, should we put the slide before with the data from the...
Country like Pakistan. From this linguistic map, you can see Chinese government actually legally recognized 55 minorities and also recognized their languages. Right? From a very early establishment of China, government had this law written into the constitution to allow multilingual education in China. This policy was made in the 50s and reinforced in 80s and 91. And China's multilingual situation is similar to Pakistan, and there are about 5 different language families in China. Government recognized about 80 languages, but in fact, from research, there are about 400 languages spoken in China. Most languages only have oral form. Right? You can see from this policy, very early, government said if your language has a traditional script, you can use that language for medium instruction in schools. Actually, this policy has been implemented for 60 years. The second policy is for those languages without written form. You can use oral language to teach children. That's basically the early policy, right? So we can see China has got a very good multilingual policy, but when we look at implementations, will be different, okay? So basically, China has this pyramid language hierarchy, language policy. On the top is a national language, it's a Putonghua, in English, Mandarin language, and also Chinese characters. This policy, the national policy, initially made in 1940s, and in the 80s written into law, so all the Chinese citizens has to know this language. But China has got another second layer of language policy, is regional language policy, and China recognized 5 autonomous regions, okay, Uyghur, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and Tibetan Autonomous Region, Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, and the Zhuang Autonomous Region. That's another one is for Hui people, because they don't have a language. They share the Mandarin language with the Chinese, so they don't have a language policy. And another policy is Hong Kong, since 1997, become a special administration region, right? So this regional language policy have been effective. So if you live in these regions, basically the main language instruction can be in the mother tongue. But for the local levels, language in 30 autonomous prefecture and 120 autonomous counties, and also over 1,000 autonomous townships, language situation is not that good. And actually, in fact, since 1980s, a lot of languages become endangered. Okay, from this hierarchy, we can see multi-models approaches have been implemented in China. The model 1 is L1 based multilingual education. All the subjects in schools be taught in L1, and plus L2 Chinese is compulsory from primary school. And model 2 is all subjects in L2 Chinese, and L1 of the language will be taught as a compulsory subject. Model 3 is major subjects like math and physics. All these major subjects will be taught in Mandarin, and some subjects like music, cultural, something will be taught in mother tongue. So these three major models have been implemented in all the regions I mentioned. There's another model which is still under pilot studies. Is mother tongue will be used in primary school in the morning to teach math and other things. And in the afternoon, Chinese will be used to teach the same thing, right? This is a small scale of pilot studies. And I heard the reports has been very successful. So I will mainly talk about the three models which have been effective since 1949. The first this is based on my case studies in the Mongolia region. So model one, a mother tongue education in the Mongolian language was model of China since the beginning of the establishment. In fact, in the Mongolia region was established in 1947, before the China, Republic of China formally established. So the model is very successful, and but you can see since the 1980s, there's a sharp declining mother tongue education from primary school and also secondary school to model 2, Chinese-based medium instruction. Why this happened? Because parents against this policy want to send the kids to Chinese medium instruction schools. So this model now is really almost kind of finished, I think. And I reckon Mongolian language in this region become actually endangered. Okay, so children actually born after 1990s, they can't speak Mongolian language. They can only speak Mandarin. Okay, the second model I think is quite successful is Uyghur mother tongue education. And the model 1 was very, very successful. They have not only teach children from primary school to finish the high school, they also have examination system. Children take mother tongue examination to go to universities, still happening. But the government now try to promote Model 2 with the Chinese instruction. Also Model 3, half the subjects teaching in L1, half teach L2. Okay, this is the current situation. Okay, so if you want to know my case studies, I have done 5 case studies in different regions. This book was published in 2014, and I described, had the detailed case studies in 5 regions. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about English teaching in China and Hong Kong. From my study about teaching English for the minorities, we can say there's no official national language to teach English, right? But there's implementations through examinations. Children want to go to, after junior high school, you want to go to senior high school, you must pass exam, English exam. Also go to university, you pass the exam, and you graduate. You can't get your degree before you finish level 4 of college English. So all the implementation are controlled just by examinations. I think Hong Kong's experience, maybe we should talk about, is very successful. You know, Hong Kong returned to China in 1997. The government immediately adopted the mother tongue education policy for children, right? So before 1997, the situation was all the primary school were taught through Cantonese. It's a dialect of Chinese, not Mandarin. All taught by Cantonese, but high school all taught in English. After 1997, the government basically made this decision. If the children have a higher level of like grades in math or in science, so they have a better English, these kids can go to EMI schools, English medium instruction schools, but the normal kids have to go to CMI schools, which is taught by Cantonese, right? So this basically based on these sound principles that it is fundamentally necessary for students to acquire a threshold level of proficiency in English. Otherwise, the EMI is likely to have limited effect on academic performance. This policy raised a lot of debates, and basically government changed to only 100 schools are EMI schools, and the other rest, 490 schools, are CMI schools, right? So there's a lot of issues about whether this policy is good or not, but from teachers, I think a lot of teachers actually, before EMI schools, they can't teach in English, right? They still have problems. So the government made this policy, also made a very good, I think, implementation policy, which is employ native speakers from Australia, from England, from other places, and native speakers teachers in each of these schools support the teachers, right, as resources, and also to give teachers support. So this is one of the good policy. Also, after 1997, Mandarin was also introduced in Hong Kong's schools. So Mandarin is one subject, not medium instruction. If you go to look at Hong Kong's high schools, they teach 3 languages. They use 3 languages in schools: Cantonese, mother tongue, and English, second language, Mandarin, third language. So government try to promote this trilingual biliteracy policy. I think has been very successful. Okay, and no time. Okay, so I was going to share with you Australia's experience. I don't have time. I just quickly move to my conclusion. I want to say is even strong written policies like China supporting mother tongue education and multilingual education don't necessarily help minority languages maintenance, also education equality. And so unless the policy are implemented very seriously, right, have a good implementation, it's very important. Also, good policy needs well-planned implementation, and also we need to focus diversity of learners. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, back to you, 2 minutes on the tables again. Same thing, what are you taking away, and what questions or comments will you have? Bilingual education program in Sri Lanka.
Well, I'm going to discuss about the experience, Sri Lankan experience of bilingual education program. To make it easy to understand, I will divide my content into 5 main parts as a short description about the country, and then background of the bilingual education, then policies of bilingual education, and an analysis of successes and the strengths and the challenges of bilingual education program to make an idea about the sustainable factors of bilingual education program of Sri Lanka, and then 3 guiding questions. So Sri Lanka is a very small country, however, it is a multilingual, multicultural and multi-ethnic country, and in this slide you can see the population and the different ethnic groups, and Sri Lanka has an unified language policy which is provided by the Constitution in 1978, and also it is added an amendment, 13th amendment to the Constitution. The language policy is, it is chapter 4 of the Constitution, and the language policies, we have two main languages, Sinhala and Tamil. So these two languages, both languages are considered as national languages as well as official languages. National languages mean in education as the medium of instruction, these two languages are used. And for administrative purposes, they are considered as official languages. And by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, English has been given a status of linked language. That means it is used to link these two majority groups, Sinhalese and Tamils, because they don't know each other's language. So English is taken as the linked language. So taken this provision in the education system, bilingual education program has been introduced. So that is the language policy. And we also have an unified curricular policy which implemented throughout the country. According to the curriculum policy, language is used in two ways, as a subject and also as a medium of instruction. By medium, we have two kinds of schools, Sinhala medium and Tamil medium schools. And as subjects, Sinhala and Tamil are taught as the first languages, and also these languages are taught as second national languages. The importance of that is Tamil students are taught Sinhala as the second national languages and also the Sinhala students has to learn Tamil as the second national language. And the status of English in the curriculum is the second language. English is considered as the second language, and it is a compulsory subject from grade 3 onwards. So that is the curriculum policy. And as I said, there are two kinds of, by medium, there are two kinds of schools, and in these schools, bilingual education program is implemented, and it was introduced in 2001. And the purpose of bilingual education is, as the keynote speaker correctly said in the morning, actually it is to establish or it is to promote synergy. That means there is no minority majority languages in our country, so we need to promote Sinhala and Tamil with English. So that is synergy. That means we need to promote the proficiency of students in both languages, but not only the bilingualism, we need to promote mainly biliteracy. That means thinking in two languages. So that is the important feature of our bilingual education program. We are not limiting to bilingualism, that means the conversational ability in two languages, but we are going beyond that to biliteracy, that means thinking in two languages. According to school census data, there are 10,162 schools in our country, and there are 1,017 schools with bilingual education program, and this program is implemented only from grade 6, that means at the secondary level. In the primary level, only the national languages, that is Sinhala and Tamil, are used for medium as instruction. Therefore, the percentage of bilingual schools with bilingual education program is 14%, and you can see the 3%, there are 3% of bilingual education students. And I will skip this slide, and I want to discuss about factors of sustainability. As you can see, I have analyzed some points as the strong points which represents S, and we points. So you can see one strong point is entry point. Our entry point is grade 6. So they have a good foundation of mother tongue in the primary education. And flexibility, this is an option. That means it depends on the willingness of the students. So it's a strong point, and more choices. That means a range of subjects are given, and the students can switch in from L2 to L1 at any time if they think it is difficult for them to follow the bilingual education program. And the methodology is content and language integrated learning. That means it is also flexible. Wherever necessary or whenever necessary, the teacher can use L1 in the classroom. Then the teacher qualifications, we have bilingual education teachers, we train bilingual education teachers, and there are some English language teachers as well. Then policy consultation process, so it's a weakness because we have top-down approach and we don't have any explicit policy, and there's no consultation with professionals. And equity in access, that is on the one hand it is a strong point because it is given the willingness to the student, but the access is very limited according to the resources. And the higher education, medium of instruction in higher education, that is in the universities, we have English medium courses in the universities, so they can continue their programs. And then resources and capacity building, that is a weak point because no systematic recruitments, deployment system, and also the materials. So one of the critical factors is the lacking of the policy. As I said, we don't have explicit policy, and then the second thing is also connected to it because there's no vision, lack of vision and policy thinking. And the other thing is political will. Because sometimes there are fluctuations in the program according to the political will, but we think if we have a stable policy, we would have to overcome the political will. Finally, I am going to discuss about the 3 guiding questions. The first question is, one of the challenges is how to address equity, the principle of equity in education through this program. Because still, as you can see, we have 3% of student population and also 14% of schools. We are not able to reach to all the schools to give the opportunity to all the students. And the second thing is, how can we achieve the expected outcomes of the program? Our expected outcomes are bilingualism and biliteracy. But because of the perceptions of the public and the other stakeholders, still after 15 years past, they think they perceive this as an English medium program, not as a bilingual education program. Still they label this as a bilingual English medium program, and they think that actually it is a privilege to be a bilingual education student and bilingual education teacher. But in their vocabulary, it is not bilingual education, but English medium education. The third question is, how can we go to a paradigm shift? Paradigm shift in the sense of actually. At present, they take this as another monolingual education program, but we have to perceive this as a bilingual education program, another system, but that perception is lacking in the system. So our the ultimate issue is how to change their mindsets. So if we can change their mind shift through a paradigm shift, then I think other 2 issues can be solved. Because if the mindsets can be changed, then they will look at this, they will take this as a bilingual education program, and then we can increase the access. For example, we can teach one subject for all the students, like that there are strategies. So our ultimate challenge is how to change the mindsets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, last time over to you. Now this time is slightly different. You've got 2 minutes to talk about what you've heard from Priyatha and think about your comments and questions, and then I'm going to give you an extra minute to summarise what you've talked about on your table across the 4 presentations, and to identify 1 or 2 questions that are your most burning ones that you would like to ask as we come back to the panel. Okay, so you've got 3 minutes. A question or comment from each of the tables, and then I'll open it up in case there are other individual comments to be made. So should we start? Do we have the microphones? Yeah, should we start perhaps with this table at the back? Do you have a question or comment? That's you turning around.
All of the presentations were really very interesting and great. We, from this table, have one question from Naureen, Dr. Naureen and Dr. John Simpson. So, what do you think? We don't want to ask the scholars or university professors or experts, but if we ask the community, the community members, do they want to start MLE? If they want to start MLE, what would be the first steps to start MLE from your perspectives?
Okay, thanks. So I think the question is, if a community wanted to start an MLE program in their schools, what would be the first steps that they would take from your experience? Okay, I think we'll take 1 more question and then we'll do both questions at the same time. Okay. Can we have a question from this table in the middle?
We have a question. Well, our question is, I think, directed at John Simpson. I think he mentioned something about having a federal policy, regional policies at the school level, at the local and district level. So we would like to have some ideas on that. What is your view on that? How can you have that, this level of diversity and variation?
Okay, thank you very much. So that's talking about the layers of policy that John was talking about. Okay, thank you. Naureen?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that's very clear, not only from my own literature review, but what the other panelists have said so far, it's strong advocacy work would be needed to get buy-in from all stakeholders, including parents, community members, teachers, and the head teachers, about their attitudes towards language, also what's the best way of learning a mother tongue. While effective implementation is required, at the same time there's a need for strong advocacy work by activists. With respect to implementation, why people have been saying parents are not fools. Yeah, and one of the reasons why this buy-in for MLE is so weak, because MLE policies have been implemented very poorly. So more investment needs to be done in the effective implementation of MLE policies, and John talked about the significance of textbooks, learning materials, the significance of preparing teachers who are able to teach in more than one language. Also, the significance of recruiting teachers based on their linguistic backgrounds. So for example, if a province in Pakistan wants to start with MLE, we don't know the linguistic background of our teachers. Probably we know how many have certain levels, acquired certain levels of qualification or training. They are male or female. Beyond that, we don't know much about what language they speak at home, what language they can teach. So within the implementation domain, these are required, but then based on international literature, what's the best way of going about MLE? And there is substantial evidence to indicate that the benefits of weak models are very low and they are not sustainable. So if a province is thinking of starting MLE, then research evidence abundantly makes it clear that it's the strong models that produce long-lasting results, strong impact in terms of learning outcomes, and also staged transition to another language. So not all subjects taught in the foreign language or whatever is the second or third language at the same time. Somebody has already talked about the significance of delaying instruction in written English until the time when children are proficient in reading, speaking, and writing their mother tongue. So delaying instruction or significance of oral proficiency in English is good because that's how people learn languages. They first speak it, understand it, and then they move on to the text. So these are some of the suggestions that we can draw upon international literature, and John might have some other things as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, actually. Thanks for all that. I would just kind of add to that. I mean, I think some basic parameters that one would be looking at would be simply doing a kind of a 360-degree kind of survey and asking oneself the question, well, what resources do we have available? If we're really committed to this as a community and we would like to see our local language, you know, cross the threshold of the school and be welcomed and embraced in the formal education domain. So what resources do we have to bring this about? I mean, within the community in terms of speakers of the language, perhaps adults who have some training or who could be used as classroom assistants. What capacity do we have, and what support could we get and buy-in, for example, from the local education authorities? Because I think in terms of sustainability, I think there's got to be some political and commitment from the local authorities if it's going to be successful. Of course, another key aspect is asking the question, how ready is the local language for use in the formal domain? Does it have I mean, if we're talking about, for example, reading and writing, is there a standardized orthography version of the language that everyone agrees? Are there available written materials of primers or simple stories or whatever? Or are we talking about introducing it orally, if you like? And that, of course, raises the issue of what level of education. There's a huge and growing focus now on the pre-primary sector as hugely important, the first 5 years, really, of a child's life as being kind of make or break in terms of, you know, laying the foundation for future learning and success in life. So the pre-primary sector, I think, is a really good one to focus attention on in terms of local languages and using that as the seed ground, if you like, for planting the local languages and allowing them to grow from pre-primary to primary, etc. And of course, in pre-primary, we're talking largely about oral you know, communication, listening and speaking, songs and games and so on. I think that's a fantastic opportunity and entry point, as it were, for local languages and communities.
Linda, did you want to add anything, or Priyatha, to the questions? Okay. I think there's something there also about time as well, and how long something like this takes to bring in. It's not something that can happen overnight. And I was reading just recently, there's a book out called Cleverlands, I don't know if anyone's heard of it, about the highest performing education systems. And they were talking about Finland. and saying that the seeds of the policy which led to, or the seeds of the change, the reform in education that led to what Finland is achieving now, has taken 20 years for them to get to that point. So I think, although that's not specifically related to language and education, it's very similar with this situation. It's not something that can happen quickly, and that investment needs to be planned for and allowed to take place over a period of time. Priyatha, did you want to add?
I think this sub-Saharan African experience is the other side of the coin of our story, because they are trying to promote the native languages while we are trying to promote English with the native languages. And we had this the similar experience in 1956 time. Sometimes you may know, in 1956 Sri Lanka introduced mother tongue only policy, but then there were English medium schools and English medium education is promoted under the British colonial era, and when the mother tongue only policy introduced, actually Sri Lanka faced the same experience, because we didn't have the writers, the material developers, teachers like that, and again when we introduced the bilingual education program in 2001, we had to face the same experience, because then we didn't have teachers who are capable of teaching in English. So it's like a cycle.
Thank you. There was also a question from this table about the levels of policy. Did you want to say a bit about that?
Thanks, Amy. Yes, just briefly. I think the example I gave was in Ethiopia, which is a federal state with a very decentralized education system. But there is considered to be a very progressive language and education policy at federal level, which mandates, as it were, use of indigenous language. In many cases, it's Amharic, particularly in the northern parts of Ethiopia. And of course, the system doesn't move to English medium until secondary level. And of course, that has been studied quite widely and seen to produce really good results through mother tongue-based education, including in English. So the kids who are studying in their own language for 6 to 8 years before switching to English are actually getting better results in English as well as the other subjects. However, due to the decentralized nature of the system, what often happens at regional or provincial level is that given the huge kind of aspiration to English and pressure from parents and communities, some regions have actually opted out of the national framework and adopted policies of moving to English medium at a much earlier stage. Some cases after P3, after P4, after P5. So now, across the country, there's a basic lack of alignment between the federal policy and what's happening at regional level, such that the federal government is now turning to language and education experts saying, can you please come and do a situation analysis and come and give us recommendations how we can actually resolve this situation, because we've got a whole host of different frameworks now and lots of issues in implementation, and it's simply not working out. The other level I mentioned was at the school, having school or district language policies, and I'm not sure how common this is actually in low and middle income contexts, but certainly in the UK and possibly in the States also, thinking particularly of places which are, I was going to use the term multilingual hotspots, but where there's a great diversity of speakers of different languages, different non-dominant languages in places like London or New York or whatever, then what you often find at school level, the school actually has a language policy, which is designed to, essentially it's a statement of how the school will support all pupils. It's about inclusion, and it's about ensuring that speakers of English as a second or additional language are actually given the support that's needed to ensure that they progress throughout the system. So I think in terms of balance and coherence, it's really important not to forget that at school level it's important for there to be good. And of course you can introduce, and there's some very interesting work going on in Ghana at the moment, looking at language mapping. So going into schools and communities to finding out, well, exactly which are the languages that are used here, who speaks what to whom, where and when. And that's the first point in getting a handle on the local kind of language situation and to inform decisions at school level or local level as to what kind of policies can we enact here and practices to ensure an equitable, equal opportunities for all students. So I'd just like to throw that out as something in the mix.
Thank you. Okay, shall we take another couple of questions? Do you have one on this table at the front? Here? And also this table behind you as well. Okay, and we'll come to you in a second.
Basically, the students or the children can learn a second language if they are competent in their English one. Like if they are competent in their mother tongue. So it is acknowledged in linguistics. So I have a question from all of these highly experts and highly professional people. Like, do they have the same problem in their community as we have in Pakistan? Like in Pakistan, it happens that if the students are very good in the Punjabi, so they cannot be good in English. Like they cannot be, they cannot understand English well, or if they are even good in Urdu, so they cannot understand English, or they cannot learn English well. Why? Because they are confused about the linguistic parameters that like phonology and the orthographic pattern and everything. So like the structure, if you just talk about in English and Urdu, so like subject, verb and object agreement, so we have very different sentence pattern in Urdu. Like first comes subject and then like object and then comes the verb. So the same thing like happen in other grammatical contents when we teach them in, when we teach them as a teacher in the classes, when we teach English to them. So it happens that they cannot understand well.
Okay, so is your question, if there's a speaker of one language, why is it sometimes the case that they find it difficult to learn another language?
Definitely. It's my understanding that they cannot learn English well, whatever, like we can try, we can make the policies, we just learn the strategies, like being a teacher, whatever we do, they cannot learn better until, because this is the point, like if they are very good in their Punjabi and Urdu, so they cannot understand or understand English well, or they cannot learn well. Why? Because they will make the mistakes of he wasn't went to school.
Okay. Okay. I'm just going to stop you there. So I think we've got the question. Any responses to the question there? Sure.
Thank you.
Yes, we have the same problem. As I said, in our curriculum, English is considered as the second language, but in use, it is a foreign language. That means in the rural area, the students actually they don't have any exposure to the language, so it's a foreign language for them. But through the bilingual education program, actually it's like there's in a tall table there's a cake, and the student is too short to take that cake, to reach to the cake like that. But through the bilingual education program, they get the support to reach to that cake, because in the bilingual education program, as I said, our methodology is content and language integrated learning. Content means the subject and the language means the medium of instruction. In our context, it is English, and whenever necessary, we will give the language support to the student in the content classroom. So, and also they have the acquisition of the language. So without knowing, they pick up the language, they use the language. So the results shows, the performance of the students shows, those are the evidence that those students now they are able to learn the English as a second language. So that is our experience.
Just very quickly to add to that, I think that's so crucially important, the amount of exposure to the language in question, opportunities to practice and use the language. And the third thing, of course, is the quality of the language learning experience. And Jim Cummins has done some very interesting work on this, and that you may want to refer to, around the idea of there being a minimum threshold level of proficiency for bilingualism to actually have a positive effect on learning and so on. And I think that's for me, that's quite a useful notion to hold on to, that in order to reap the benefits of being bilingual and learning through two languages, you do actually need to achieve that basic threshold. And you know, that's where the investment, the return on the investment starts to appear.
Thank you, John. And also just to draw on some comments that have been made earlier today, I know Carol was talking about it in her keynote, and also others have mentioned, that drawing on the language resources that exist for those students that they have for their first language, and helping them to see the links between what they're learning in English or another second or third or foreign language against their own mother tongue or another home language that they're familiar with, and trying to find those parallels for them so it doesn't seem like a completely different thing that they're trying to grapple with. Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the presenters in the previous panel, Zubair, I think, emphasized the significance of understanding the phonology, the morphology, the syntax of the 2 or the 3 languages that teachers are expected to teach, and to make those differences explicit. But the lack of competence of pupils in English, and to associate that with speakers of particular languages being at a disadvantage to learn English, I think that connection will be refuted by empirical research strongly, to essentialize Punjabi speakers as being unable to learn English, or to essentialize Pakhtun speakers as being unable to speak Urdu. I think empirical research will not support that assumption.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's down to approach, really, is what we're saying. Approach and the resources that you use to enable that learning for the students and for them to take on board for themselves as well. Should we take 1 or 2 more questions? I know we've run over slightly. I've allowed a few more minutes just because we had that extra tea break. Did you have a question on this table? I know, so that you had one here. Should we have one more question from here? And one question from here if you have one over here. Yeah? Okay. Thank you.
Pakistan, Sindhi is in the academia, in the school, even in the colleges, but it has no standard of education. We cannot refer to the Sindhis while educating for other languages in northern Pakistan. Because nobody has given any attention to enhance the standard of education in Sindhi. When we are going to the policymakers in KP to get recognized our local languages, so they usually raise this question, that what Sindhis have achieved by putting their language into the academia. So what would you reply to that kind of question if you are a Pakistani and educating for minor languages?
Okay, thank you. And if you can just pass the microphone. If you have another question over here, was there something you wanted to ask? Okay, on this table. We'll just take one more and then we'll do them together.
Well, my question to all the panelists would be, because I could see a common thread amongst all the panelists as they were sort of celebrating multilingualism, multilingual education, and they were sort of advocating mother tongue based education, right? Well, from academic research perspective, yes, they are a kind of sensible proposals to put forward. But why, what is the problem? Why we have not been able to impress upon the policymakers at the top? What are the reasons of this contradiction between the policies at the top and the proposals being put forward by researchers like us? And this is how to sort of square this gap between the policymakers and the researchers or academicians.
Okay, thank you. So we had the 2 questions. Did you want to respond to the first question?
think my response has to be rather brief to that. I'm probably one of the least qualified people in the room to comment on that, not really knowing very much about the history of Sindhi and its involvement in the education system. So I think I would want to, before responding to that, to be much better informed. I can think of many different reasons why it seemed to be that the implication of your question was that the officials are saying essentially Sindhi it's not working well as a, that I think is what I heard you saying, and so I think for me I would want to investigate some of the reasons for that and speak with all the stakeholders, visit some schools, see what's actually going on to get a much better handle to make an informed comment on that. But it's very good that you raised that, and perhaps others in the audience will have more informed comments to make about that. But thank you for that question.
Sir, can I elaborate? Can I elaborate? Because no Sindhi, no student from the school where Sindhi is taught has reached any milestone we can refer to. He has not created anything despite the fact that Sindhi has been in the school since 25 to 30 years. So no success stories we have still about the Sindhi. So that's the story about Sindhi.
Thanks, and that for me, I suppose, raises other questions as to is that more to do with wider issues in society about the place of Sindhi and how it's valued or not, and perhaps there are some success stories, but they haven't actually been recognised or identified. I don't know. I think that it's a very interesting situation which one would want to look at. So, did you want to say something?
I mean, policymakers, if they are not interested in the introduction of MLE, they will highlight the example of Sindh as a reason for not doing it. But as John said, one need to dig deep. What are the reasons for Sindh not doing well in terms of quality or equity in education, and find out the extent to which language in education policy is responsible for that. Language in education policy is one important thing. It's not the only thing in education. Other things are equally important. This has been emphasized several times during the course of the day. However, getting the language in education policy right is absolutely important, because without getting that right, everything else in education will not work. Even if you get all the teachers, textbooks, everything else will collapse if you get the language in education policy right. But this is not to say that if you get the language in education policy right, automatically you will reap all the benefits until and unless you implement that policy effectively.
Thank you. Okay, and just to that last question about the disconnect between policy and the evidence that is coming out from research, do you have a comment on that? Why is there that disconnect between them? Linda?
I can see the gap between policy and implementation. There's also a reason, like parents are concerned about children's future and career aspect. I think from the government point of view, if they could kind of promote these employment opportunities in that language, could help the implementation. When I mentioned about in the Mongolia's situation, in the recent years, actually government to recognize because the job market, also further education situation, and they have a new policy now, is for older people who want to join a civil service job. You have to go through 2 languages, and you have to know Chinese. Also, you have to pass the Mongolian language. So because this policy actually has positive effect on the implementation, so parents actually realize, and children are bilingual is asset, it's not problems, right? So also they can get jobs in the government, especially in the region. This actually has very positive thing for that. So the job market perhaps plays a very important role in the multilingual education, I think.
Okay, and also, I think also just going back to the question, what is it about the policy, the way that the policy is derived that is not connecting with what's coming out from the evidence, either after something's been implemented and it's on the ground, or from the evidence that's coming out from research studies that are done by universities or think tanks or whatever? Why is that? I think that was really your question, wasn't it?
I mean, it's just the politics of policy making and how decisions are made, and it's not just distinctive about Pakistan. Across the world, in the global north, in the global south, policymakers make decisions on the basis of their own interest or what they think is right rather than on the basis of evidence. Recently, several policy decisions have been undertaken by the Tory government in England and Wales that has got nothing to do whatsoever with evidence-based, or whether teachers or head teachers, they are, sacrificing their salary by protesting, because in England, if you go on strike, you are not paid for that days of work. So they are contesting those policies, but decisions have been made not because on the basis of evidence, but because what policymakers believe in, and that happens in this arena as well. But you can change the perceptions of policymakers through creating pressure groups like this event. Yeah. So in order to pressurize the government, you need buy-in from parents who also. You said in your presentation that you will not touch upon governance matters, but why parents believe in the myth of English or in the myth of Urdu is exactly because of the governance matters, because of the language hierarchies, because of the politics, because of the power, the job market. The desire for English or the desire for Urdu emerges, it is encouraged, and the desire for mother tongue instruction is discouraged. So it's all about politics, I think, rather than a disconnect between research, even if you elaborately present in a very nice way, unless they are really interested in following the advice, they will not act upon it.
I think just one last thing to say about that. I think that we in this room have a responsibility for making that research and evidence available and accessible to policymakers and those working at different levels of government and practitioners as well. Practitioners is very important. We mustn't forget about that. So I think there's a job for us there, and I agree, the connect is not there yet, but I think that's our responsibility, and we should take that responsibility and do something about it. Okay, we're going to finish because we are over time. Having one more question. One more question? Okay, all right. One more question.
It's not a question, it's just a comment on responding to Manan's question. I just want to join my voice with Dr. Durrani. Policy is actually something which is a dilemma in all over the country and in other countries also. Policy should come from the bottom, but in Pakistan and other countries it is coming from the top. And top is we are always committed with the international commitments, with the international challenges, and that type drug of policy that where we see our country in as a part of that level which is set by the other countries or the international commitments. That is why the policy and implementation always remain the mismatch. And we don't have the monitoring indicators. Normally, if you see, we are not following the monitoring indicators of the education, the targets of the MDGs till 2015. So, where the policy is coming? The policy should come from the bottom. But we are planning with the international commitments, and the people who are designing the policy, they are not actually educated to design the policy. They are just to frame and implement. So if we address this dilemma, then we will reduce the gap between the policy and the implementation. Thank you.
But in these 15 years, at least at the level of global policy, there is a greater support for MLE, if that is a solace that we can take. Yeah. So once this proposed thematic indicator becomes accepted, then governments will be ranked according to the percentage of primary grade students who are taught in their first language or mother tongue.
And that comes back to the point you made at the beginning, that there's 40% of children who are not educated in a language that's familiar to them, and that is a tragedy, really. So, yeah, I guess we'll end on a sad note. Okay, John, did you want to just say one last thing?
Just on a positive note, and I think that also the fact that this is written into the SDGs is a way of addressing the short-term cycles of governments. Because for me, this is one of the key issues, that learning a language, becoming proficient, is a long-term endeavour. We know it takes 6 to 8 years to gain the cognitive academic language proficiency. That's beyond the life cycle of any government. But the fact that this is written into the SDGs, and as Naureen was saying, actually commits governments to that, it is a way of addressing the short-termism and acknowledging that this actually takes time. Quality takes time, but we can get there.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to all of the panelists. Thank you for your patience and for playing along with the task. Thank you. I'm going to call you back. So we are going to move on to our third speaker for this panel. This is Dr. Linda Tsung, and again from the University of Sydney. And she's going to be focusing on multilingual education in China. And if time permits, she will also share some insights about multilingual education in Australia.
No, it's teaching Chinese in Australia.